I tend to think about Black education as having its own heritage and lineage in the United States. White people don't have to think that way, but we do. We have a lineage. We have a history of Black intellectual thought, Black buildings, Black pedagogy, Black teaching, Black learning, Black assessment. It's documented decade by decade. You can go all the way back to the beginning, and you will find a unbreakable, unceasing chain link through all of history. We need to recover that, and we need to think that way about our own Black educational history. At the same time, you can't divorce that from American public education, because we influenced the founding of what today we consider to be tax-funded universal public education. That came out of Reconstruction. That came out of when Black folks had this short time, this epoch of upsetting the apple cart and being put into Congress or being put into, positions. What did they do during that time? They set up universal systems for everybody. So one of the things they set up was tax-funded universal public education, not just for Blacks, but for whites too, for everybody. Because they understood what I understand today is that ignorant white people are a danger to everybody. So let's educate everybody, right?
It is Freedom Friday, and you are still not free.
Welcome, friends and family. It's another episode of the Freedom Friday. We're back again. It's Friday, and you are still not free, but hopefully you will be freer after this time with Sharif, Ish, and me. We are back at it, fellas. It feels like we have been gone. There was a lot of Fridays that have passed, and what happened? What happened? Y'all fell off. I was here. I was sitting here waiting for you, and then y'all just fell off. Where'd you go? What happened?
It's been a long time since I left you.
It has been a long time.
No, it's good to be back. A little family reunion here and there. I had a couple conferences. Philly hosted AERA, so saw Ish several times there. Saw a lot of our friends and scholars and activists.
Tell people what that is. What is AERA?
It is the largest, and I forget what the acronym stands for. Education research is the ER part. So largest education research conference, I believe in the world. So a lot of the, scholars who, we connect with, draw from, help inform the practice, and practice helps inform the research. We're there. So got to, for the first time, met Vanessa Siddle Walker in person. We had been engaged over the years. I was just thrilled to finally see her, hug her, and be embraced by her. So, and they're so encouraging. She's like, I see the work, keep going, keep going, keep going. Gloria Ladson Billings, same thing. Linda Darling Hammond, same thing.
Do you know Linda personally?
Yeah, well, we've worked together a few times.
All right, you're going to have to make an intro for me. I need to meet her. But for people listening, Vanessa Siddle Walker, Sharif just threw that out there very casually. Vanessa Siddle Walker was there. But Vanessa Siddle Walker is one of the preeminent scholars in the United States who has captured what went down with Black teachers prior to 1954, prior to Brown. So if you're looking for scholarship on how Black teachers worked together across state lines, how they created curriculum for Black schools and Black children, how they translated assessment from white world into Black schools. They had a system. It was a logical system. It was a strong system. And when we talk about 1954 and Brown, we often talk about it like we lost jobs. Like, oh my God, they fired our teachers. We very rarely talk about what Vanessa Siddle Walker, Dr. Walker, talks about, which is, no, we lost institutional knowledge, because prior to 1954, those Black teachers were making progress with their students. They were actually closing all the gaps that mattered back then, like high school graduation gaps and all that. And then came 1954, handed our students over to white school boards, white school districts without the Black teachers. And here we are. We're ignorant. So anyways, Ish, how you doing, brother?
Doing well, brother. Surviving. And Sharif, I'm kind of geeked out that you met her at the John. I've been The Lost Education of Horace Tate. That book is just phenomenal.
Yeah, I was just telling my dad he got to read that, John.
Yeah, it just switches up the whole game, but it also shows you the intellectual genealogy. And I was reading that, John, at the same time I was reading Fugitive Pedagogy And at the same time, I was reading the White Architects of Black Education. And all those books overlapped one another about the overall story. So I was super hyped. And also, I got to mention that Sharif introduced me to Linda Darling Hammond, and I was able to like cart some of her stuff to her next session and have a brief conversation.
He
So
became her page like immediately.
yeah,
He's like, hey, I'll walk you to your session so I could tap into your thinking a little bit more, which is dope. Like that's
yeah,
you're like
man.
an apprentice for like 15, 20 minutes. That's how they get their education.
Yeah, man. So I just want to say last weekend was phenomenal. We need to do stuff like that more. I think it needs to be put in some black hands. You know what I mean? The AERA is a monster organization. What did they say? 18,000 people came through Philadelphia. But the conversations about education, about where things are today, it was powerful.
So, just for our listeners, because we talk a little bit inside baseball sometimes, and on all of this, which is it's a reflection on how long we've been doing this and how many relationships we have and how many rooms we've been in that the public hasn't been in, right? So we see the relationships, we see the data, we've been on panels, we get to hear, right? And the public doesn't. But this is what I want to say about this. You just talked about AERA, which is one of the most preeminent kind of gathering places of scholars and scholarship and people who write the studies, who do the studies on education. You talked about it in a positive way, right? One of America's most preeminent commentarists or part of the intelligentsia, Rick Hess from American Enterprise Institute wrote a piece on AERA. And I won't go through the whole thing, but he slammed the whole thing as too woke. Right. He's like, the whole thing is supposed to be about, data and research and all that. And he goes into all this stuff about who was there this year. Now, these are all people that we respect, but from his point of view, what he's telling the public, the white public, is that it's a problem. So he says this: while ERA's formal mission is to advance knowledge about education, to encourage scholarly inquiry related to education, and to promote the use of research to improve education and serve the public good, it exhibits remarkably little interest in knowledge, inquiry, or healthy discourse. Indeed, ERA operates more as a bastion of far-left identitarian groupthink than scholarly organization. Wow. How can we see things so differently, y'all?
Yeah.
It's almost like we came from different places.
Always. And it reminds me of when Pondicio gave pushback and said, oh, new schools it's too many black folks here. There's too many people talking about racial justice. We just want to talk about educational justice. And as we always say, there's no such thing as educational justice without racial justice. It is impossible to achieve educational justice without racial justice. At the same time, it's impossible to get to racial justice without educational justice, right? So they constantly want to separate and say, no, don't talk about race. Don't talk about white supremacy. Just let's look at this math problem. That's it. That's all we need,
They want the education without the education.
Yeah, basically. They want the schooling, right? It's almost like, how they talk about like, bread is supposed to be, they remove the wheat, they remove the good stuff, the fiber, all the things, and then they give you this plastic. And that's what they want, a plastic education for our kids, right?
What's more inside baseball for everybody who's listening, what Sharif just talked about. So Sharif, I just want to put some context on what you just said. There's a national gathering every year called New Schools Venture Fund. I forgot what they call their conference, but one year, years ago, probably about 5 or 6, maybe 8 years ago, 7 years ago, I can't remember how long. One year I was there and they had the dude who did the Nat Turner movie. If I don't remember his name, was his name Ish? Nate Parker. So Nate Parker was on the stage for one part about this, talking about racial justice. On another part of it was Brittany Packnett, who had done some, a panel, I think, on kind of like racial justice and education. And she was knee deep in the Black Lives Matter stuff then. But other than that, it was a very white affair, and everybody was white. It was like, those of us that were not white had to act white for a day. And you do every year at that event. So, anyways, there were rumblings that people were mad and walking out, like white men were standing up and walking out because it's kind of this, we didn't come here for this type of stuff. I can't even believe you invited those people and put them on stage. It was kind of this whisper campaign. And then, as you mentioned, Sharif, Robert Pondisio, who wasn't there, wrote a piece about how woke the event was based upon his interviews with white men who wouldn't give their name, but wanted him to write something about how much of an affront it was to have to listen to any of this Black Lives Matter stuff. I only bring this up and give the background on this because if you're interested in how my view started to change, Robert wrote something and then I wrote something back about it. And that is the beginning of my demise in reform world. And this was years ago. This was the beginning of my exit. And I didn't know it at the time, but that was watching how people didn't challenge Robert at all. And even in fact, some of them agreed with him. I ended up in a meeting at American Enterprise Institute on Massachusetts Avenue in Washington, D.C. with Robert Pondisio and Michael Petrilli and Rick Hess and Kaya Henderson and Brittany Packnett and people from the New Schools Venture Fund, a room full of people, and we were supposed to hash out our differences. We were supposed to, come on, guys, we're all part of the same movement. Let's just... And what I said in that meeting, and it still remains true to me, Brittany Packnett didn't write anything about y'all. So you all are the aggressors. I don't know if you ever saw First Blood, but, Sly Stallone says you draw first blood and then I finish it, right? So they drew first blood on us by attacking our sisters who just for having a voice and having, and when I saw that, and I saw some of our own people go soft in the fact of like Brittany getting attacked and, our people getting attacked, I knew that reform was some BS. Well, anyways, listen, that was a long lead up into our conversation today. We're talking about public education and what they might not want you to know. And some of that, what we just said, is some of the backroom stuff that they may not want you to know about public education. But today we want to talk about the historical part of public education, particularly its roots and evolutions that have shaped it into what it is today. It's the journey. We'll uncover the significant influence of a system developed across the Atlantic, one that not only transformed the educational landscape in America, but also carried with it profound social implications. Our story begins in the 19th century with a pivotal figure, Horace Mann, often celebrated as the father of American public education, an advocate for reform and a visionary in his own right. Mann was inspired by a model he found in his home country, not in his home country, but in Prussia, present-day Germany. This model, known for its rigor and state control, piqued his interest during a transformative era in American history. Mann went over there, and so did a whole bunch of PhDs in the United States, and they learned from Prussia. And the Prussian school system had been predicated on the idea that they had lost too many wars, and they wanted to figure out a way to train their soldiers to be obedient, because the reason that they thought they lost the wars was that they had too many disobedient soldiers. So they developed the system, which was imported back to the United States. Horace Mann wasn't the only one who went over there. As a matter of fact, the first superintendents of public education were all PhDs who went to Prussia, learned that system, and brought it back and implemented it in their states. The first state to really be designed that way is America's oldest public school system, which is Massachusetts, right? And that's where Horace Mann brought it back to. Public education has become a lot of things since then, but that is the origin. The origin, the stock material of public education is one that was designed to create obedient soldiers in Germany because they lost too many wars. So it's a very efficient system, just like German engineering is. It's the Mercedes-Benz of thought control. Just so you know. Anyways, that's my history. I just want to give people a little bit of setup. What do you think, brothers?
First, I got to say, I read something recently that even blew my mind even deeper about the very foundation of the intellectual genealogy of how pedagogy, how we think of education within this society. So a lot of people don't know that some of the earliest, psychologists, educational psychologists like John Dewey, folks that you study, were actually their mentor was a known outright racist who promulgated racist ideas and grew up in the South during the enslavement period and adopted those views of white Southerners, obviously, and represented those views. So that he was the leading person, the first person to get a PhD in psychology from Harvard that actually influenced what educational psychology became, and then define what normality is in education, what the goals of education should be. So again, just like foreign policy and international relations being framed at first as race development, we cannot separate where these ideas came out of the time period, right? Of where these ideas come from and how that influenced thinking, even though later on, as people get further and further away from that time period and it became less acceptable to talk in those terms, still kind of rely on those foundational conceptual instructions of thinking about how education should be approached. So I just want to bring that up right from jump, because I read that recently in an article and it just blew my mind that that was the foundation of a lot of educational psychology in which we study today.
Do you think some of it stayed in there? I'm sorry, Sharif, I was just going to ask.
No, go ahead.
Ish, do you think that like some of that lasted in education, or like did it end at some point? Like the influence of those originators who had kind of racist backgrounds or implications. Look at y'all faces. As I ask this question, look at your faces.
That definitely ended. It ended a long time ago with the stroke of a pen.
Yeah, well, after Brown, right? After Brown versus Board of Education, it was all over. This shapes
that fixed it.
This shapes the very foundation of something, right? So if the foundation is shaped by that and informed by these ideas, you best believe whatever is built from that foundation will represent an extension of what that original foundation was all about, and rest and lie on top of that. So when we even talk about education and miseducation, right? Carter G. Woodson talked about this heavily, right? Going through these systems to be educated in a way that actually devalues yourself and then uplifts the normalization of whiteness as what the standard bearer of what education should look like and how it should be structured. And then, of course, you add in the factory model where certain people should only get certain types of education, right? In the South, it was technical education. We can't forget Booker T. Washington was held up and lauded and given tons of funds from white philanthropists all over the place, from the North, from the South, and held up as a Black leader because one of the fundamental things that he emphasized, well, Black people need to learn technical education so they can build their own things, right? And all those. And there's a lot of positive that came out of that, but also at the very foundation of that, it was based and premised off of Black people's inability to be able to take it to a liberal education in the sense of how whiteness has defined liberal education.
Now, that we, about to go to another whole. I was about to say, you're gonna have problems with me on that one because here's what I think on that one. The truth about public education is that I just said this actually in another show in my last week's podcast. I did not know this. We did a show on career and technical education, CTE. And turns out that CTE, career and technical education, is actually older than compulsory mainstream education. The first kind of law that put money into teaching people trades and skills was 1911. And as you might understand, which you would believe, that in 1911, that money was going to go to white folks, right? To people that they wanted to put into trades and train up to do stuff where they would make money, and it went to them. So Booker T. Washington and others, I think they just had a very simple calculation. In a capitalist country, if you can't own anything, you can't make anything, you can't fix anything, whatever, you're going to be ass out. So Black folks should make they have buildings at HBCUs where the bricks were made by Black people. The bricks themselves were made by Black people. They were laid by Black people. There were Black architects that actually designed the buildings. The whole buildings. I stayed in one of these houses where everything about the house was 100% made by Black people. The gardens, the landscaping, the architecture, the bricks, the mortar, everything created and built, not created, but made by Black hands and Black minds. And I think that was Booker T's version of education, Black education, which is, it might be the precursor. And Ish, this ain't gonna help you at all, but this might be the precursor to Black capitalism, right? Like if we could just own a piece of ourselves. That at least will fund the other stuff we want to do.
Well, I just think the White House was also solely built by Black hands. So are we saying the same thing when we, so, it was gardened by Black people? Black people served in this room.
This is true.
These buildings were, so like, I think this is the extension, like, and it's less of people's inability and need for these type of skills, but more of like, these are the skills that these people need to learn because they're incapable of thinking in the modern Western sense. And that was the argument that these folks made. I mean, even W.E.B. Du Bois had to constantly like push back against people saying, oh, well, it's because you have white blood in you that you're even capable of understanding. Remember, these pseudo-racial sciences existed as the foundation of how people thought in the academy, how people learned. And so they developed things like anthropology and say, there's certain levels of civilization. I mean, like Puerto Rico became part a colony of the United States. And some of the arguments they made that it shouldn't be independent is because they're mongrels. They're incapable of learning and being able to govern themselves.
The interesting part in some of this is, when you had this Booker W.E.B. Conversation going on, there were Black women who were creating schools that were actually bringing both of those ideas together. Yes, self-reliance, self-determination to be able to fix and build your own, and what's the deep thought of philosophy and mathematics and other things. And they were creating schools, and they're like, y'all have that conversation, y'all brothers, go ahead. We're actually building schools that's going to insert both of these. And in the book that Chris, you introduced me to, The Forgotten Sisterhood. I hadn't read the book. I heard some of the names before, and I would always text them like, yo, what was the third name again? What was the fourth name? I probably asked that 10 times. So I finally just went and got the book. And and if you haven't read that, audience, Forgotten Sisterhood, Lucy Craft Laney, Mary McLeod Bethune, Nancy Helen Burroughs, and Charlotte Hawkins. Their work and their progeny, their intellectual progeny, who continued to do that. It wasn't just sisters building these schools, but, just giving an example of, there were some folks in that time that saw the need for both. I love, go ahead.
Well, to your point, it was the women. And actually a lot of these women, Mary McLeod Bethune. So first of all, the first one, I think, in that sisterhood, I want to say was Lucy Craft Laney, who we've talked about before. So Lucy Craft Laney got the first charter in Georgia to start a Black kindergarten, and then it became later grades. Her school actually ended up enduring all the way through the 70s, or into the 70s, as a matter of fact. And guess what happened? Integration happened, and it closed that long-standing school. But one of her students was Mary McLeod Bethune. So Mary McLeod Bethune comes out of her school and then goes and starts other schools, right? And they start having kind of like a generation of sisters doing that with each other. They're writing each other's letters. They have some very different opinions. Some of them are more about like, we need to teach our young ladies manners. And we need to some of them are like, no, we need to teach them how to sew. And others are like, no, we need to teach them how to study and read. But you can hear that in their letters. But the thing that they had in common was that they were being left out of a lot of meetings between the Du Boises of the world and the Booker T. Washingtons of the world. And they would go to all their events, but they would be kind of put at a side table. Right. And they would listen to these men who were talking all this stuff, who weren't really running schools, but they were actually running schools and having to go to these things to get the money to be able to do their schooling. So they had to listen to all this stuff where they were kind of like, yeah, there goes Booker again talking his stuff or whatever, there he goes. But Booker had all the money. Yeah. Booker was like he was the HNIC at the time. When it came to money, you had to go through Booker because he had the most of it of anybody. Anyways, this is about public education, but I will say I'm going to win this argument right now with this. This is how I'm going to win this argument right now.
What you got?
How many schools did Du Bois open, create, establish that generated waves and waves and waves of the Black middle class over a century?
Well, I would argue that Du Bois contributed more to the intellectual foundation.
Stop it.
I mean, Chris brings this argument, and there's practicality in what he says. And what I also have to mention is the school of thought is so important in the revolution, so important in informing those who are going to build the actual structure, the school of thought. So we can't, it's innumerous. We can't count
Stop it.
the
Stop it.
the impact of the
Stop it.
school of thought of W.B. Du Bois.
Okay,
you know what I mean?
okay. Let's stick here. We can stick here for a minute.
20th century.
Yeah.
One more thing I got to say about
Go ahead. Go ahead.
And it goes back to what you said about creating people in the middle class, right? A lot of people attach this talented 10th thing that Du Bois talked about early in his career. Du Bois ended up denouncing the talented 10th and kind of reaching to the same conclusion that Carter G. Woodson was talking about 2 decades earlier. And mind you, Du Bois and Carter G. Woodson didn't really bang with one another either. And Woodson and W.B. Du Bois started to get to the same point where Du Bois is like, yo, a lot of people who don't deserve to go to college do, and a lot of people who should go to college and be advanced in the race don't. And the people that do are more concerned with about being important, being in rooms, owning things, instead of actually fighting for the liberation of their people. So I really want to just like push back on the Du Boisian kind of like middle class kind of advancement that like he was early in his career with that, and he definitely denounced it later.
And then he moved to Africa. Listen,
My
joke about Du Bois is my joke about him is he was eating cucumber sandwiches up north while Booker T was building schools, right? And you talked about like they said it was because of the white blood in him. It wasn't because of the white blood in him. It was because of his black blood and some whites. So let's just stay clear on what he was doing with his life. But anyways, let me say this because I think we constantly do this. We constantly misunderstand Booker's real contribution, what he did. Booker T. Washington didn't. The rip on him that he didn't want us to learn liberal arts is nonsense because there was liberal arts in all those schools. He actually, you went to those schools. It's not like you just sat and sewed all day or whatever. They actually had reading instruction, math instruction, all the other stuff, but you left with a trade, right? You left with the ability to earn. But the 5,500 schools that Booker T. Washington built across the American South were all the schools that are called the Rosenwald schools. 5,500 of them across the American South. That is who's responsible for Maya Angelou and Andrew Young and blah, blah. I could keep going down the list. They all came out of Rosenwald schools, these 5,500 schools. Now that at the time that I started latching on to that story, that was more than the number of charter schools today that we have, right? So it was an own industry where Black people themselves in the communities built those schools. And they owned a third of those schools. A third came from the public education system, and a third came from Booker's fund that he created. The buildings were nice. They had the same layout across all of them. They were meant to have sunlight. And then the communities themselves elected the teachers, the Black teachers, and then took care of them, right? So to become a teacher in a Rosenwald school, you had to have community support and input, and they would collect their nickels
community
and
certification.
So these were the first. These weren't like Booker T industrial schools. These were formative schools. He built 5,500. We talk about the HBCUs. We don't talk about the elementary schools that he built, where all the Black educators were working and the Black community was owning those schools. They got to set the curriculum. They got to teach the kids things like democracy and civil rights and how to fight back, how to basically all the stuff that the civil rights movement came out of those early schools, right? And some of them still exist, as a matter of fact, and most of them are like historic landmarks. We forget all about them, though. One brother that I know that talks about him a lot is Curtis Valentine. Yeah, Curtis talks about him a lot. Yeah. His family actually were involved in Rosenwald schools. But when I first read that, the Federal Reserve of the United States did a study on those schools to see whether they were effective or not. And it turns out they were very effective. They actually were very effective, and they produced kind of the first waves of our, not just our doers, but our thinkers, our poets, a lot of notable Black people came out of those early Black schools. So anyways.
Our intellectual. Interesting. Go ahead. Well, I would just say, 100% Rosenwald schools. And it's interesting. Some of the folks that we named earlier, like Vanessa Siddle Walker, actually are talking about how to revisit that.
That's right.
How do we remember those spaces, and make it even more, because we can't necessarily rely on, some of those the funding from government or the philanthropists. And so, like, what would it mean to have that, for our community, for the 8 million Black children, and as many who would want to, like, how do we build? Because I think the piece that you're making, Chris, I think is really important. And when Abigail Henry would teach, about that era, she wouldn't do one. She was like, really, to look at the Black thought at the time, you have to look at Booker T, W.E.B, and Marcus Garvey, and really look at them as this, trifecta that informs Black intellectual thought at that time. And then obviously Carter G. Woodson being a grounding component, that goes through all of it. So, but yeah, there, like, people are still thinking about how do we reinvent, remember, go back and fetch what we've lost, and that space. 5,500 schools. Can you imagine?
That's a lot of schools. That's a lot of schools.
A lot of schools.
That's a whole system. That's a system of schools across the South.
Oh yeah.
And I'm definitely going to go into that because I've heard things, but I haven't delved. I definitely have worked with Abigail Henry and taught all this period myself in the same way of the intellectual genealogy of Black thought. And don't get it twisted. Without Booker T, there would have been no Marcus Garvey. Without Marcus Garvey, would have been no Malcolm X. All like I am, and no Black Panther Party, and you know what I mean. So I understand that, and I wasn't critical of Booker T. Washington right there. I was saying that more white philanthropists were more willing to fund him because he would use that language with them. And he would clap back on people like William Monroe Trotter or anyone else who was fighting like actively for Black political power outside of his locus of control, which was problematic, but, nobody's perfect. But in no way am I discounting Booker T. Washington. It's more of like discounting the fact or pointing out the fact that white people are more comfortable funding people like that who say things like that to them in order to advance, and it fits into the worldview of white people during that time period. And arguably even to today, a lot of folks still think in those terms of what Black children are able and unable to do.
Yeah, I mean, is it a matter of like what Chris Dad used to say, infiltrate and double cross? Like is that part of like what his some of his rhetoric, like you're like, whoa, bro, you know what I mean?
And he was very effective. I mean, this is the thing about Booker. I think we one-dimensionalize him. But what we forget about are things like he used to say one thing publicly and privately he was funding civil rights lawsuits. So at the same time that he was saying we shouldn't fight for that, he was funding it behind the scenes. We talk very little about that.
Yeah.
We talk very little about this. So,
Yeah. Another thing you used to bring up when we would talk about this was this idea of like, his relationship to him being in the South, so deeply in the South. And what did it mean to move in that kind of space as opposed to
he came out of slavery.
in New England? Yeah.
He came out of slavery. Right. And this is my thing where I hold this brother up when it comes. It's such a weird history, just weird. And these things are weird because the difference between him and Du Bois is that Du Bois did start with the talented 10 stuff. I know what you're saying. I know what you're saying is she had a transformation, but he did start with the bougie bullshit. What Booker was saying was it was a educational theology of the Black masses. Like that's fine that a few of y'all are going to go up there and go to college in New England and other places. But meanwhile, down here in the South, we have this thing called Black masses, and nobody is actually getting them capitalized. Right. None of that stuff you're doing up there in Harvard and Princeton and all that type of stuff. That's great. Have fun with that. But the Black masses are not being capitalized. So he had a Black mass strategy, whereas Du Bois had this strategy of if we could just get our best and brightest situated, then they can lead the race and, they'll eventually build something. Right. Anyways, I do want to say this. How does this relate to public education? Well, this relates to public education in this way. I tend to think about Black education as having its own heritage and lineage in the United States. And the more we think about that, we need, as white people don't have to think that way, but we do. We have a lineage. We have a history of Black intellectual thought, Black buildings, Black pedagogy, Black teaching, Black learning, Black assessment. It's documented decade by decade. You can go all the way back to the beginning and you will find a unbreakable, unceasing chain link, through all of history. We need to recover that, and we need to think that way about our own Black educational history. At the same time, you can't divorce that from American public education, because we influenced the founding of what today we consider to be tax-funded universal public education. That came out of Reconstruction. That came out of when Black folks had this short time, this epoch of upsetting the apple cart and being put into Congress, or being put into, like, positions. What did they do during that time? They set up universal systems for everybody. So one of the things they set up was tax-funded universal public education, not just for Blacks, but for whites too, for everybody. Because they understood what I understand today is that, like, ignorant white people are a danger to everybody. So let's educate everybody, right? Right.
Facts.
So anyways, that's how I draw the line from that lineage that we're talking about, Black education, to universal schooling, period, in the United States, was that we had a foundation there.
Yeah, and I think that, a really important part that needs to be understood anytime that people are talking about this public education, like, I think it's important for us to remember, like, just the backlash to that, right? And so this idea of tax funded public, education, you had one, folks who were really into private schools and private tutors, just like you had your doctor come into your house at that time if you were wealthy. So did your teacher. So did the tutor, right? And so the idea of even this for masses, because one, if you remember the founding of America, it was about landowners and educated people. That was a small minority of folks. So this whole idea of, like, the masses being educated was, contrast Americanism. It contrasted this whole project that they were, a group of folks were in love with. This was not the ideal of that you would have these educated citizens. The founding fathers did not respect the masses in that kind of way, and didn't feel that they needed to be educated, they needed to be involved, engaged, any of that kind of stuff. So this was, and you tag on that it was, Black folks. Then you had another group of folks who were like, yo, I don't need my child to learn how to read. I need them to help me in the field. It was an agricultural society, right? And so you had, you're talking about, like, millions of people that would be in either one of those camps. And then you have this small minority, like, pushing for, free public good that education is supposed to represent. So universal. These forces, yeah, exactly. So these forces were all swirling. So it wasn't, just about the, Black folks and we don't want them educated. It was also these massive, kind of traditions, so to speak, that were already happening in American landscape.
So, on that point, I'll just build just quickly. One of the things that we don't talk about in public education that relates to the Black influence on public education is what you just said is true. There was a time where private education was the way to go for the elite, for the landowners, private tutors, private schools, private lessons, and they didn't want their masses to become educated. And today, the lineage of today, people saying we should pull everything out of the public system, which I myself was part of, actually putting that thought out in the world, which I have recanted and renounced as an idea. Because that was predicated on the idea that these public schools, these government schools, aren't ours. And the truth is they are ours. It's like where we have had a stronghold in the system over time, and we created. And in the days when that was created, those privatizing people existed to say, we shouldn't do that. We shouldn't raise taxes to create universal schools for everybody. We should privatize education so that it can be every man for themselves, so that the rich will know that their kids get educated, nobody else does, so that they can have workers, so that they can have slaves, they can have, domestics, people working in their houses. I'm only making the line between that existed back then and it exists today, right? It's the same group of people who have said the same shit over this long period of time. And today, right? Like I wouldn't have heard this in the speeches 2 years ago in my mind. Like my mind wouldn't have deciphered it the way that I'm saying it to you right now. Now it couldn't be more clear to me. Ding, 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 ding. Why do you want to pull everybody out of the government schools? So that you can put them in a private market and you can have your way with them. So there will be no oversight, no regulation, no, it'll be every man for themselves. And of course, when that happens, the affluent do what? they prosper. Everybody else does what? They falter, and they end up working for the rich. So anyways,
this is such a beautiful moment. This is such a beautiful moment.
Well, tell me why it's a beautiful moment, brother.
I just, you know what, the thing, it reminds me of, any like really intelligent person, they're continuing to be informed, evolve, and like at the base of it is like those who are sincere and genuine. And I look at you as one of those brothers who are sincere and genuine, and I just love that about you and appreciate that about you.
I appreciate you saying that, brother. I'm a learning person. I'm a learner, so I'm always learning.
Now, listen. I am. Both of y'all are some of the most intellectually honest folks I know, and that's why I think these conversations are so generative, not just like going back and forth on an opinion, right? Because we're learning from each other, that intersubjectivity of dialogue with each other around these ideas. But I definitely need to point out that, and this goes off of what Sharif was just previously saying, even though there was a public system, Black folks were still monitored for their education. I think of the white architects of Black education. Yeah, all these schools were wonderful, but the way that Booker T. Washington got extra funding eventually and everything was to allow white philanthropists to visit, to do tours at any time at the drop of the hat. And then the Black, students and teachers would get and show shows and what they're doing, but they would have to secretly actually teach the children how to learn how to buck against this system and build that agency. So no matter what they say about you as the problem within this society, you're not the problem. You're a genius, you're capable, you're bright. And that's what's not allowed to be said. And I would argue a lot of that still kind of goes on in different types of ways. Of course, it's not as blatant as it was in the Jim Crow South, but we cannot ignore that all the folks you mentioned before were developing and also teaching the children that would become what's known as the modern civil rights movement. And they were very clear about what they were agitating for. They weren't agitating for their Black child to sit next to the white child. They were advocating for them to be able to get them funds as much as the funds that those other, that white schools were getting, that their children didn't have to walk past two or three schools until they got to their shack. You know what I mean? And that was more of the argument. Even Martin King talks about that. And I love The Lost Education of Horace Tate because Vanessa Sitter Walker does a wonderful job fleshing out that real kind of story. But fast forward to today, to what you were just saying, Chris, these folks, even though they want to privatize everything, they still want the public dollars.
Yeah, isn't that crazy? That's crazy. If the market is so powerful, bruh, why do you need the public money? Why don't you just create a system of private schools with all your great ideas and put it in a regular market? Listen, this is one thing I want to say to my privatizing friends. You're hypocritical because you want the public dollars to do your private thing. But if you were sticking with your own orthodoxy, you would create a system of low-cost private schools across the country that could survive on their own in some way, shape, or form. That used to happen. It used to be called Catholic schools, right? And Catholic schools had to live on what Catholics donated. But over time, Catholics stopped donating. And the libertarian ideal is that, when you don't force people to give money through taxes, that they'll do it on their own just for charity. Well, listen, there are a lot of rich Catholics in the United States. And why is the Catholic Church losing its money? Why are they not able to hold their schools open? It's because that libertarian nonsense is bullshit. Listen, this goes to what you guys are talking about right now. I want to say this because, Ish, this is going to touch on your buttons, I think, a little bit. So in 1902, the General Education Board was a non-governmental organization designed to support higher education and was funded primarily by John D. Rockefeller. Throughout his lifetime, he donated approximately $180 million. That's a lot of money, right? Especially for old times. The board's objectives were to promote farming, to establish public high schools in the South, and to develop programs for African Americans. So they wanted to develop, they already did higher ed. Now they wanted to do high schools, right? A system of high schools across the South. Here's a quote from Frederick T. Gates, one of the members of the General Education Board. In our dream, we have limitless resources, and the people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hand. We shall not search for embryo great artists, painters, musicians, nor lawyers, doctors, preachers, politicians, statesmen, of whom we have ample supply. The task we set before ourselves is very simple, as well as a very beautiful one: to train these people as we find them to be perfectly ideal, to a perfectly ideal life just where they are. Right. So we don't want them to rise up above their circumstances. We just want to help them sustain themselves in their current circumstances. We don't want them to be artists, painters, musicians, lawyers, doctors, preachers, politicians, statesmen. We don't want them to be any of that. We're not setting up a system of high schools for that. We're setting up a system of high schools for poverty maintenance rather than poverty ending. That's a secret that people don't want you to know about public education and
Whatever
philanthropy.
your lot is, stay there and be happy.
Be happy. Don't worry.
Don't worry. Be happy.
Be happy.
If you hear me say it, you can smack me right here.
I mean, come on, right? Like, there are parallels to today from that back then, right? Sometimes philanthropists add something good to the landscape. Sometimes they have overarching power to create systems. Or to change systems to their own liking. And this is one of those perfect examples. Brothers, let me ask you this, because this was a show about what they might not tell you about public education, or what we don't learn about public education. You both have been educators. You both have been in public systems. You both have seen it from inside out. There go the balloons again. Y'all have both seen it from the inside out. What is something that you think you've seen with your own eyes or experience that the public wouldn't know about education and the system, how it works?
I mean, one of the things, and it's complicated in a way, because I'm all about more funding, more just funding, sustainable, predictable, equitable. Like those who need more English language learners, more lead in your city. Like then chances are you're going to need more investment in education. Also, just the amount of waste that happens is astounding. I remember being a new teacher and learning about how many thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of closets, basements, other places in the country that brand new books are stored and never opened. The amount of dust that collects on things that were purchased and never used. It was, and so it's, for me, it's yes, more money, and then how it's being used, who's accountable for it, who's making the decisions. I don't think people understand like the depth of that. And I'm always nervous because people also be like, oh, that means you don't need anything. Just, and it's not quite, the same mathematical principle. It's you're being underfunded and you're wasting some of the money, that's the little bit of pennies that you get. So it's that combination. It's gut wrenching when you actually think about it, just across the city and then across the country, how that plays out.
So not just funding, but spending.
Mm-hmm.
Like we always talk about, we need to fully fund education. We don't get to that second part of, we also need to monitor how school leaders are spending our money.
Yeah, and I wish spending was looked more or less as an investment. Like, okay, I'm investing in this. I've known schools that have changed their curriculum 4 or 5 years straight. You know how much money it costs for textbooks for thousands of kids? And textbook folks like, yeah, all right, cool. Oh, all right, cool. Like, like they love that. But then actually, what's happening? And listen, I believe in high quality material, and like I think too many folks who make those decisions are not deeply grounded in research and pedagogy in education. And then it's all of these disconnects between curriculum purchasers, the implementers. I've coached principals in the past who purchased all this funds and then aren't observing to see if it happened, aren't doing professional development to see if folks are getting work. Like they're disconnected. It's like it's so many disconnects in the systems. It's infuriating.
Yeah, man, that is a high one that I would say. That waste stuff is real. And it isn't slowing down because there's an incentive to
Mhm.
waste. And then on the reverse side of that, then people talk about how dire our public school systems are as a reason to get more funding, which is just like within itself another flip on itself. But I would also say the overemphasis, and Chris, you were just touching on this, of compliance as a school, as school. So you ask any group of students, and I think specifically in Philadelphia, how many of y'all went through a class all year round, didn't learn anything but got an A, right? Every single student's hand goes up. And be like, well, you did learn something. If you were cutting up, if you questioned the teacher, do you think you would have gotten that A? And of course, that's a universal no. So, like, even just pointing out and asking students to think, that is something that doesn't happen enough in our school buildings. Our teachers are encouraged too much to teach box checking as an indicator of student success rather than engaging in critical thought instead of engaging in criticality of the world. And I find this too often is disincentivized, right? You're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to actually be change makers. You're supposed to be compliant workers who eventually will get a good job if you follow the rules, if you check off the right boxes. And if you don't, you failed. You're the issue. You're the problem. And I think that is so steeped within it. And I'm just speaking from my narrowed, 15 years in the game, because I even know that it's larger than that, right? And there's many components. It's not as black and white as folks like to make it seem, but then at the same time, it is that many people, most who never get an education beyond high school, are never exposed or given the tools necessary to do what we call as critical thought, a questioning. And if anything, school actually takes that out of folks. And I think Bettina Love calls that spirit murdering, which happens well too often in our schools. So as a teacher, that's like what I see as like one of those biggest things in public school that folks kind of don't really talk about, but just go through the motions. Like, I'm just doing my job. We're like, well, just doing your job has led to some of the most greatest atrocities in human history.
It's funny that I think we talked about it before. Wisconsin actually was passing a bill that outlawed certain words that you couldn't use in the
It's like
schools
100
anymore.
words. Yeah,
It's like
that
100
joke was
words.
crazy.
Diversity, equity, inclusion. Those all were words that were going to be outlawed because of this bill. But many of the words came out of Bettina Love's trainings. So spirit murdering was one of the ones that was on that list. You won't ever be able to say this phrase again. You can't say that phrase in any training in a public school, right? That this is how authoritarian things have gotten now, where they're just outlawing words and stuff. You just can't. It's like the dictionary is going to be a book we're going to ban next. You can't say these words. Kind of response to two things that you said. So one thing that you said, Sharif, about the spending and like seeing books that had never been used. When I became a school board member, one of the things I did see, someone took me on a tour of the district and they took me to the attic. And there was this place in the attic that was very big. It was large and it was dusty. And there were places in that attic where there were full boxes of textbooks that had never been opened or used, but had been purchased by the district. There were instruments, like music band instruments that had been bought and hadn't been. And I remember thinking to myself, how could this be? Like, how can we have all this stuff? I remember going into a meeting. This is also being a layperson. So I'm a layperson coming on the board, seeing this stuff. One of the meetings they sent me to was they were about to pick a math curriculum for the district. And they put out 3 different versions of 3 different curriculums in front of us, the school board members, and said, these are the 3 we're looking at. And I said, well, do you guys have any, do the vendors have any data on how any of these have worked, like in Baltimore or in any, urban districts like ours? And they said, oh, yeah, no, they can't do that. They don't do that. And I was like, well, I mean, what do you mean? We're about to spend millions of dollars on a math curriculum. How could they not have data? Oh, yeah, that's proprietary. They can't tell you how it's working in other districts. And it's like, whispered, if you really want to know how it's working, you got to pick up a phone and call somebody in those other districts and just get them to tell you the real, because the vendors won't tell you. But here was my favorite part of it. So the vendor's response to me when I asked that was, well, it takes 10 years to know whether it's working or not. So we sell it to you, and then we implement it. And then in year 3, we evaluate. And then year 6, we evaluate. In year 9, we evaluate. And then in year 10, we'll be able to tell you whether it worked or not. And I'm like, okay, so which one of us is stupid? Yeah. Which one of us is stupid? Like, so we're going to pay you millions of dollars. You're going to give us a product that you can't tell us how it works or if it works. And you're not going to be able to tell us if it worked for us for a decade, right? When there will be a new school board and a new superintendent, and you will do it all over again. You will rinse, wash, and repeat after we're gone from here. End of the story. I'll just like the end of it was they picked the teachers in the district had different opinions about which one. There was a math war. And the teachers in the richer schools wanted one curriculum, and the teachers in the poorer schools wanted a different curriculum. And the teachers in the richer schools wanted this math curriculum that was word heavy, had lots of text, lots of reading, not just the math equations or whatever. The teachers in the poorer schools, especially schools with English as a second language and more Somali kids or whatnot, wanted more math and less words, wanted it to require less of that. Which I love, because I hated reading as a kid, all that, like, a train leaves Baltimore at whatever time and it gets to Philly, blah, blah, blah. And I'm sitting there like, why is it going to Philly? Well, what's in Philly? I don't care about the distance and the travel and the speed,
so
all that.
Disrespectful even as a kid to even ask something like that. You know what I mean?
Why are you going to Philly? But anyways, I say all that just to say we were on the hook for a lot of money. We had no data. We spent it. It happened. And it turns out it worked well for the richer kids in the district, and it worked worse for the kids that couldn't do the language heavy math, because that's not math for them. That was like they were having to do language and math in those situations. And then the other thing I noticed as a school board member was the number of contracts we signed off on that we didn't know what they were. Like, so you'd come to a meeting, they'd give you the meeting notes and everything for the night, and would have all these contracts. And unless you went one by one and asked the superintendent one by one, you didn't even know what you were passing. And all those contracts were former teachers that were being paid like $6,000 here, $10,000 there, $100,000 there, who were retired. And their new hustle was selling the district stuff through their friends. Like, I'm friendly with this person in the curriculum and development, blah, blah. So when we talk about spending, as a board member, there was lots of stuff we approved. We didn't even know what it was. Like, we didn't. My first night as a school board member, we were passing a budget the very first night on the school board. Right before we went up on the dais to have our meeting, they handed us each a big fat ass binder that was the budget that we were going to pass that night. They handed it to us on our way up to go have our first board meeting. And in that first board meeting, I said, I'm not voting for shit that I didn't read. Oh, there goes Chris being a problem again. There he goes being a problem. Yeah, we were just supposed to pass it.
Man. Get with the program.
So, and then Ish, on your point, I wonder if you think that like the reason that we have so many teachers that can't think outside of the box, think critically, like an artist way of doing their job, their craft, is because the system needs to be systematized, and they need to put people in like widgets into positions, and the whole thing around like steps and lanes and milestones and evaluations and all that stuff has to be kind of standardized across a lot of things. So that doesn't lend itself to having a whole bunch of people with academic freedom. That doesn't lend itself to a whole bunch of teachers being able to come in and move left and right how they see fit for their students. It needs to be more standardized. I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm just wondering if you think that that's part of the reason it might keep teachers out of the profession, who would be the ones who would be more kind of like critical, reflective, trying different things.
Well, like I was just saying, it's incentivized to go along with the program. It's disincentivized to question the program. Right. So you're not supposed to be questioning, like, why are we doing this? This makes no sense. Didn't we do something like this like a couple years ago, and y'all recycling this and put a new tag on it and paying for it again? And we knew it didn't work then. So why are we doubling down on it now? Yeah, those type of questions you're not supposed to ask, right? You're supposed to go along with the program. And I'm definitely not saying that it's pure like that. There's many complexities, obviously, but I think the general thrust and general energy around this is kind of somewhat what you said around standardization and the need to know what is going on and the need to like control what's going on. But there is a level of certainty, especially from an educator's point of view, that is good. Like it's good to know that everybody that's been in the game as long as I gets paid this much, right? That those things are good, right? And being able to negotiate for collectively for higher wages, right? Those things are good in my opinion. Now, when it becomes problematic is when it becomes at the detriment of the students, where the primary focus shifts away from what education is, and you're more concerned about your paycheck and job security, which again incentivizes complacency and compliance over the ability of really advocating and fighting for our children and doing what's right. And don't get it twisted, a lot of our children in that, some of our brightest and smartest at a young age, start fighting and going against that before they even know what that even means, and then get chucked to the side before they even develop the skills to understand that they have natural talents, they have natural intellectual abilities that are valuable.
Mm. And how do we change that? Do you blow up the system, or what do you do?
I mean, I think it's multifaceted. Definitely have to flood the system with folks who are being educated outside of the system, where they can be, part of and push back. And it's multi-layered, right? Like when I think about some of my students who I loved and were also a pain in the ass. Like they were every single thing they were challenging. And you know what? They were, instead of trying to make that like no fit into the system, we tried to like really meet them halfway and say, okay, how do we intellectually engage them in a way? Like one of my favorites, like Khalif Younger. This brother is such a brilliant entrepreneur now, seeing him as, out in the world, making an impact, creating jobs. He was all these things, but he was like, you know what, like this structure is just too much. Now we could have like, been like oppressive and like, no, you mold yourself into this and kind of, shape, but we tried to like continue to engage, because you have some who were like, no, hey, I'm adaptable, like, or find this structure. There are others who are like, nah, like I find it stifling and it's choking me out, right? We had, and then we had others that I think about, like, did not I was not able to, like, figure out how to serve them even better, and they weren't happy. Like this young brother rapper, he gets so much love out in the community. Tour. I remember a tour one day. Who told me, he's like, "Oh, Mickey, y'all don't let me live, man." You know what I mean? Like, I was like, "What are you talking about, bro? Come on." My thing is like still like self-control, self-discipline, blah blah blah, heavy reading. He's like, "Yo, bro, let me live." Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, yo, you always like, you know what I mean, on me. And so I think about those kind of students all the time, and and they knew that I just had like deep love and affection, and so many, and so many of our staff did. So we're still able to build a community. And even within that community, there was still, friction sometimes, because it was just hard. You're trying to, and I think this is one of the things that people underestimate, because sometimes I hear all the rhetoric, oh, do this and let everybody be free and and you're also trying to manage 900, students that are still, their frontal lobe is being developed. And you have, intellectuals doing deeply emotional work, and some of them their frontal lobes may not also be developed. I'm about like educators, right? And so trying to manage all of that, I think, when you talk about like what people don't know, I don't think people understand how hard it is to lead a classroom in the school. And this goes way back. One thing that I did love about is a Horace Mann quote, I think. And he said, teaching is the most difficult of all arts and the profoundest of all sciences.
Mm-hmm.
It is like, it is like the, some people like, oh, just the art. I'm like, no, it's not just the art. They're so technical to take complex issues and break them down for not one kid, one-on-one tutor and understand, but a classroom full of students who may be at varying degrees of interest, ability, personality. All of that it takes such, this is why I have such reverence for dope teachers. And I think that's something that people just don't understand. Because when I see the dope teacher doing their work, not just doing their work, the pre-work that they do, the intellectual preparation to lead, like it is so, I mean, it just blows my mind when people, and I wish more people really, really understood like what goes in the planning and the mind and the thinking and the mindset of our best and brightest educators. And if people really were able to latch on to just a understanding of it, let alone most people can't do it.
I have a plan for this.
Yeah.
I have a plan for that, Sharif.
What you got?
Because I've been thinking about my presidential platform. Yesterday, I put out what my platform is.
I missed that. Is that on Substack?
No, it's on Twitter, on my Twitter thread. It goes, because I put out my presidential campaign things that I'm going to do. And it's a thread of all the things that will happen on day one when I become president. And it's lots of stuff around, like, making sure that there's free maternal care. There's 16 months of paid leave for mothers. There's a stipend for mothers and a thank you from them, from their government, thanking them for contributing to the civilization and the future of our country. And it's all, of course, free health care for children all the way through, making sure that all child's basic needs are taken care of 100% before we buy bombs. It goes through a bunch of stuff. I'm going to shut down all the teachers' colleges and then reopen only the ones that are good. It's a lot of stuff that I'm going to do with school. Make sure every school has a library and a librarian, and that banning books is actually against the law. It's just a lot of stuff I'm going to do when I become. But you just gave me an idea, right? And some people are not going to like this. It might be predicated a little bit on the TFA thing, because I think before you graduate college for anything, before you go out in the world and become an educated citizen of the United States, you should have to teach for a week. You'd have to teach for 1 week. Everybody should have to do it. So
wait a minute, did you think whose kids?
Listen. Under the direction of a veteran teacher, just like student teachers do. But that way we put fewer ignorant people out into the world who have to vote on education policy and have to vote on, like, what you just said is true. I wish more people understood, number one, how hard the job is, how much thinking it requires. We have a lot of people that say ignorant things about teaching because they're ignorant about teaching. And if we want to cure that, we should make everybody, like when I was on the school board, this is years ago, and I keep using this as a reference point. We had a rule in the district.
How many of us been on school boards in the country?
I used to learn so much stuff that I thought was crazy. I didn't know that so many of the administrators in our headquarters actually had teaching certifications. I thought they were just like business people. No, they had teaching certifications. And there was a rule that they had to teach for 1 week a year, and they hated that rule. They were trying to get us to reverse that rule. I remember thinking, wait, you mad that you have to get out of the home office for 1 week a year and go back and make sure that you're in touch with teaching and with the teaching staff and with the students and all that? Yeah, they wanted us to take that rule away. Well, not only should they do it, I think voters should have to have had that in college to see what it's like.
Yeah, one of my best
it said, no, I don't want these people in the classroom.
One of my best supervisors, principal supervisor, him and his staff would go once a week. Once a week, they were in a school, because, a week out of a year, that can end up being a little dog and pony or a little bit of anything. It may be more disruptive, like, oh, we got to pause for you to come in, but that once a week. So they were embedded in, and he wouldn't allow anything to interrupt that. And it wasn't just him. He was like, no, my team, my cabinet, you are also going to pick a school, pick a classroom, and this is where you're going to be, just to stay grounded in what the work is.
Bruh, I actually love the classroom. I would love to teach. I said this to you guys before.
Yeah. We're going to get you emergency certified, bruh.
Right, and
not even emergency. Like, we can get you certified. Yeah.
This is the part you disagree with, though. When I say that is, I would only want to teach kindergarten and first grade. Like,
I don't disagree with it. To me, I would just be like, I think those are our best teachers in so many different ways. I commend you, because I would fail at that, and I told the story before. I almost chose a different career because when I was trying to explore, I went to sub. And I was subbing in kindergarten, first grade. And when I left there at the end of that week, I went straight to 53rd Street and tell my mom, I was like, you know what, Mom, I changed my mind. Like, there's no way. I'm like, I don't see how people are able to do this. And she said, that's not the right grade for you.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like in all the people I know, some of them are definitely high school people. Like the teachers that I know, educators, some of them are like, yeah, no, I'm just going to teach high school.
Some people don't like middle school. I loved middle school.
Well, middle school is supposed to be where all hell breaks loose. But so what I was going to say about that was I volunteered at school with another dad, and I could see the look on his face 30 minutes in. He was like, he was like, this is what goes on all day long. You do this all day long. He couldn't get out of there so quick. And I kind of had a little bit of that too. I mean, it's a lot of work. But anyways, I know we got to wrap today. So I appreciate you brothers for being on again. Actually, it's good to see y'all again. What's your final word on what they don't tell you about public education? Just a final word. We'll whip it around and then we will close out.
Yeah, I would say that what they don't want you to know about public education is how essential it is to actually improve everything. Like it is a fundamental part, and the less we invest in it, the more problems we're going to continue to have. And I don't want people to interpret that saying that, oh, we don't have to fix anything on a perimeter or anything adjacent to schools. What I would say is like that is all part of improving society, is the school and that adjacent to district and what's adjacent to it. Integrated services, I think, is first and foremost. And then the last one, and this is a horrible way to end the show, but how our educators are prepared is one of the worst things about education. Mm-hmm. It is literally one of the worst things.
I'll fix it when I'm president. So just so you know. Ish, what's your final word, bro?
Same thing, what Sharif ended off with. As someone who also teaches pre-service teachers right now, I'm probably like the first time they're exposed to like anything that we even talk about on the show ever. And they're going to be slated to be in front of our children next year. So I think that it's one of the secrets is it's not a lot of times like people blame teachers. And reality is that teachers just are never really put in a position to be mentored properly or exposed to certain ideas. And when you do, they do want to. Most folks want to. And there's different personalities and different layers, right, for what that is. I tried middle school, man. That was a nightmare. It was the longest 6 weeks of my life. But I know people who love it because they love the structure. They love that challenge, right? I know people who just love the babies and just want to be around babies all day and play Imagine It. I couldn't do that life. So like the thing about education is that we really need to be supportive of one another as educators. We need to bring more people into the fold, and we need more access points for folks to have access to find out that they potentially could be great educators too. And then we need the mentors there to really guide them in that process. And that's going to take longer than a week.
That's dope. Well, as we close out, my final word is just this. Public education actually is worth fighting for. It is the mediating body that creates, in a nation of 330 million people who are all different from different backgrounds, different creeds, different religions or whatnot, you need to invent some mediating body that creates a shared fund of information and a sense of pro-social engagement. And that's what public education should do. Privatizing and atomizing that, the one thing they won't tell you about that is a road to destruction for the United States that will tear at the fibers, the social fibers of the United States. And we are already divided enough, but imagine if we atomize education in our formative years and we don't learn how to work together, cooperate, and live together and be pro-social. So what they don't tell you is you should support public education. This has been another episode of Freedom Friday, and you are still not free, but hopefully you're freer after this hour with Ish, Sharif, and me. We'll see you guys on the next show. Thank you for listening.